For 24 years, there was no dispute about who was the boss in Russia. Vladimir Putin wasn't known as the world's most feared strongman for nothing. But then last weekend, all of a sudden, his iron rule was challenged. Putin stumbled. He appeared weak and vulnerable. The man threatening to topple the tyrant was Yevgeny Prigozhin, arguably an even nastier piece of work than Putin himself. As the head of the Wagner group, he controls the brutal mercenaries who'd been fighting alongside Russian forces in the illegal war against Ukraine. What worries the world now is figuring out what Prigozhin's next move could be and where. You're looking at the worst of the worst, hardened criminals locked up in a prison near Moscow. But if you're recruiting for the brutal Wagner group, these are the best of the best. The man you see speaking in this grainy, clandestine footage is Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin.
70%! Шойгу!
He's hoping to convince these thugs to take on a new fight in Ukraine, and they will be handsomely rewarded.
Далее, через полгода, уходите домой, получив помилование. Те, кто хочет остаться с нами, остается с нами. Поэтому вариантов вернуться на зону нет никаких.
But there's also a threat.
Те, кто приезжает и в первый день говорит, куда-то я не туда попал, мы делаем отметку дезертир, и после этого следует расстрел.
How proud were you to fight for the Wagner group?
I have never regret that I was part of the Wagner group. I am proud of it.
This is the face of a trained killer. Rarely, if ever, do we hear from the men who sign up to fight for the Wagner group. But Murat Gabadulin has agreed to lift the lid on this notorious band of mercenaries.
I was appointed as a private fighter, then I was severely wounded, and then I was an assistant of Prigozhin.
What's Prigozhin like as a man?
I can say this is a very tough man. Like a leader, he is a very creative person. I think he much more smarter than most of the surrounding of the Putin.
After years in the shadows, Prigozhin and his Wagner group caused shockwaves around the world last weekend when they turned on Russia, coming within 200 kilometers of conquering the Kremlin.
Мы не дадим этому повториться. Защитим и наш народ.
It was an extraordinary stab in the back for a panicked Vladimir Putin, who first hired the murky militia a decade ago to do his dirty work in war zones around the world. You've worked with mercenary groups before. I mean, give us an insight into how they actually operate.
We think of soldiers like wives and mercenaries like prostitutes. Wives, love, service, duty, it's an ideal. And then prostitutes and mercenaries sort of stand that ideal on its head and commodify it.
Sean McFate knows a thing or two about mercenaries. He used to be one himself as a private military contractor before shifting gears to become a professor and an author on the industry.
The two things that the Wagner Group give Putin, one is plausible deniability, which we've seen in Ukraine before, Africa, the Middle East. And the second is they disguise or conceal the costs of the war to the Russian people. Russians, like Australians and Americans and Europeans, they don't like to see their soldiers coming home in body bags, but they don't care about military contractors. So it was a way for Putin to wage war without creating a lot of dead Russian soldiers.
The Wagner Group has operated in secret in dozens of countries around the world for years, using brutality to advance Russian interests, both in business and in politics. Its leader, Yevgeny Prigozhin, is a convicted criminal who went into selling hot dogs after a decade behind bars. He eventually became known as Putin's chef, as the pair hit it off with a number of questionable business deals that culminated in Prigozhin establishing a private mercenary militia for the Russian president. And nothing has defined the Wagner Group quite like the current war in Ukraine. How much progress do you think Russia would have made in Ukraine if it wasn't for the Wagner Group?
I think that Russia would have probably surrendered if it hadn't been for the Wagner Group. There was just such a bad execution of military strategy. It was only because of Yevgeny Prigozhin that this war carried on.
Vladimir Putin has many enemies, and Bill Browder is right up there. The president has declared the activist a threat to Russian security. Yet even though Putin is a vicious warlord, Bill believes he's a pussycat compared to Prigozhin. He says that's typified by a video Prigozhin published himself of the Wagner leader executing a mercenary he accused of being a traitor.
He's as brutal as ISIS terrorists. He took one of his soldiers, who he believed to be disloyal. He brought him to a room, he put his head against the wall, and then he used a sledgehammer to basically just crush his skull and kill him. And he took a video of it, and the video went onto the internet.
The guy's a dead-set psychopath.
He's the most disgusting killer you could ever imagine. And up until last weekend, he had the full backing of Vladimir Putin.
That backing was so strong, and the Wagner Group now so mainstream in Russia, that late last year, the organisation unveiled these shiny new high-rise headquarters in St. Petersburg. It was a glossy corporate front for a mob that at the very same time was being blamed for horrific acts of bastardry in Ukraine. For even hardened mercenary veterans like Marat Gabadulin, the invasion was a bridge too far. He knocked back the standard Wagner salary of $4,500 a month to fight in the conflict, a fee that is triple the average wage in Russia. You were asked to fight in Ukraine and you refused. Why did you refuse?
I think this is a criminal war. This is a very big crime. It would be better for Russia if we focus on our own inner problem.
Those huge internal issues have become very public in recent months, as Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin launched numerous tirades targeting Russia's military decision-makers for their apparent ineptitude.
Я рекомендую элите Российской Федерации соберите, сука, своих отроков.
By last weekend, it exploded into what was effectively civil war, with Wagner troops turning back from Ukraine and storming towards Moscow. Russian aircraft fired on the Wagner convoy, which in turn shot down a number of Russian helicopters. But within 24 hours, an uneasy truce was called, with Prigozhin given safe passage to exile in Belarus, for now.
Well, it's truly remarkable. I was expecting that when he gave up, they would drag him to Red Square, stick his head in a guillotine, put it on national news, and then have the blade chop off his head. That's how they like to deal with traitors. And then all of a sudden, this guy, he gets a free pass. It's crazy. And I have to believe that the reason for that is that Prigozhin controls so much of Russia's military and foreign policy, even now, that they can't kill him.
How much influence does the Wagner Group have in Russia today?
Prigozhin has huge ambitions. He must imagine he can replace Putin. So I imagine when Prigozhin was marching to Moscow, and remember the last two guys who tried to march to Moscow were Hitler and Napoleon, that he was on the phone, Prigozhin and Putin were on the phone negotiating. And for all we know, in one phone, Prigozhin had Putin, and the other phone, he may have had Zelensky trying to negotiate a deal for himself. Mercenaries play different clients against each other. It's a market strategy, not a military one.
How likely is it that either Prigozhin or Putin now ends up dead because of all of this?
I think Prigozhin and or Putin might up dead because of this. This is the most dangerous moment in the Ukrainian war so far.
Dangerous for Russia. But what does all of this mean for Ukraine? For yourself, what did you think when you saw the Wagner forces turn back on Moscow?
Well, Tom, during the first couple of hours of that eventful evening, I think many of my compatriots, we started Googling, where do I get more popcorn for this night?
It's 490 days since Russia first invaded Ukraine, and the updates can sometimes seem like white noise. But pay attention. This is the horrible daily reality. On Wednesday, 11 civilians, including 4 children, were killed in a devastating Russian missile strike on a packed pizza restaurant in the eastern Ukrainian city of Kramatorsk. 56 others were injured.
Everything that happens only makes us more angry and more determined to continue the fight and bring this to an end by defeating Russia on the battlefield.
Yuri Sak plays a pivotal role in protecting his homeland as advisor to Ukraine's Minister of Defense. It's a relentless job, but last weekend brought a rare glimmer of hope when the Wagner group of mercenaries turned away from Ukraine and headed for Moscow.
And I would like to stress that for us, for Ukrainians, all of the participants of that charade, they are either war criminals or terrorists. So on the way to Moscow, they started killing each other. But one thing nobody saw on their march, nobody saw Russian people standing up to protect their so-called loved president. This allegedly is the president which has more than 80% public support. Now, where were those 80%? They were sitting at home, maybe with their fingers crossed, hoping that something big will happen and their life will change as well.
Does the infighting between the Russians, does that show for you that they don't know what they're fighting for in Ukraine, whereas your soldiers know that they are there to defend the very existence of their country?
Tom, you're 100% right. I mean, there is no logic in what they're fighting for. Every military objective that their terrorist leader announced at the beginning of this unprovoked aggression, everything he said is complete and utter bullshit. And I think that Russian people are beginning to see that as well, both in the Russian cities as well in the trenches, because they are used as cannon fodder, these Russian soldiers, in the meat grinder tactics for what?
Ukrainians now have a new advantage that they didn't have before, that nobody could have predicted.
Bill Browder has been sounding the alarm on Vladimir Putin for decades and believes the rise of Yevgeny Prigozhin and his Wagner group is the first time that we've seen a genuine chink in the Russian president's armour. It's almost like a Frankenstein situation here. Putin has built this monster that's now become so big and strong that it's turned on its creator.
Well, it's absolutely correct. So Prigozhin is a Putin project, and Putin desperately needed him when the Russian army was failing in Ukraine, and he just got too egotistical, too big, and too powerful. But what's most interesting to me about this whole thing is that he has exposed something that Putin wanted hidden, which is that Putin is not a strong man, that he doesn't control Russia, that the Russians are not enamored with Putin. And there's nothing worse for a strong man, for somebody who wants to be seen as a brutal dictator, to be seen as a pathetic, humiliated leader. And that's what happened to Putin this last weekend.
Do you think now the big winners out of all of this, it's Ukraine?
It's clearly Ukraine. And it's not necessarily going to be a walk in the park for them going forward, but some really important strategic objectives happened, not because of anything the Ukrainians did, but because of what the Russians did.
But to capitalize on the battlefield, Ukraine needs Australia's help. Last year, Canberra gifted Kyiv a range of military hardware, most notably the Bushmaster. They've proven a huge asset on the front lines, and President Zelensky has been immensely grateful. However, the latest aid package offered by the Albanese government last week has been seen by many as a disappointment, not least for Yuri Sak's team at the Ministry of Defence.
I personally went to the Bendigo manufacturing facility, the Thales facility. I saw the Hawkeyes, I saw Bushmasters, and I saw a lot of them standing there, what looked like collecting dust. And we know as well that Australia has 59 Abrams tanks. And our friends in Australia, military experts, tell us Australia is not going to need these tanks. We need them now. And we need them now because we want to end this war.
Timing matters greatly in war. With the Wagner group turning on Putin, the Russian president is now facing threats both at home and abroad. There has been no better time for Ukraine to strike back than right now.
I can see it in your eyes, the passion. I mean, you are certain that you will win this war.
Tom, listen, I see my own children, if I'm lucky, once every 4 months. So believe you me, I am very determined. And we are normal people. We didn't plan for this. We didn't want to fight. I wanted to take my 8-year-old daughter to school every day. Give her a hug, give her a kiss. And believe you me, I will do that. And with the help of our allies, and with the help of Australia in particular, this day will come sooner rather than later.
Hello, I'm Tom Steinfort. Thank you for watching 60 Minutes Australia. Subscribe to our channel now for brand new stories and exclusive clips every week. And don't miss out on our extra minutes segments and full episodes of 60 Minutes, which are on 9now.com.au and the 9Now app.